Good morning to everyone. It's a delight for us to gather this morning. Well, it's morning where I am in New York City. We're convening a very important workshop entitled A Convening on African Wars and Its Militaries in the 21st Century, Post-COVID Emerging Trends, Challenges, and Opportunities. This is a virtual forum and expert workshop. And my name is Michael Gomez. I am the director of the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora here at New York University. We are co-sponsoring this workshop in conjunction with New York University's Center on International Cooperation, NYU School of Professional Studies, its Center for Global Affairs, the Initiative for the Study of Emerging Threats, and the Joint Civil-Military Interaction Unit. We are delighted to have you here with us today. I want to also, before I introduce the convener of the workshop, I would like to also acknowledge the administrator of CSOD, which is the acronym for the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora, Ms. Cherise Taylor, who is organizing this event, and we are in her debt for putting everything together. So what I want to do now is to introduce the convener of the workshop, Dr. Olajumoke Ayandele, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at NYU's Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora. And she is as well a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Affairs here at NYU. In her most recent position as a senior researcher at the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, Dr. Ayandele supported the production of real-time data on political violence in Nigeria. She's passionate about understanding the dynamic relationship and intersection between African governance, human development, and political stability. And she's won numerous awards and grants to conduct her research, with visiting research fellowships at the National Defense College, Abuja, and the Center for International Studies, CERI, at the Institut d'études politiques, Sciences Po in Paris. Without further ado, Dr. Ayandele.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gomez, for the introduction. I want to start off by giving a little bit more context as to why we are gathered here today. African Wars in the 21st Century is part of a bigger project that Yvan and I started last year. Our goal is to understand and assess the effectiveness of African militaries and various military interactions in the context of fragility and peace recovery. Thus, forums such as these aim to bridge that policy research gap by bringing together scholars, policy analysts, and international organization representatives like yourselves to discuss the current landscape surrounding African military studies, peace and security, and international relations from an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary perspective. Today, our workshop sessions will be tailored around the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on peace and security, identifying trends, challenges, and opportunities that can inform policy prescriptions in really building a stable and prosperous African region in a post-COVID world. Finally, we hope that this forum promotes community-engaged scholarship that centers the role of a human rights-based approach in framing security responses. We are very excited and honored to have each and every one of you here today. We look forward to hearing about your research and your various perspectives in our efforts to reimagine human security and stabilization mechanisms in a post-COVID Africa. I especially want to thank my host institution, the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora, as well as our institutional partners, the Center for International Cooperation, the Center for Global Affairs, the Joint Civil-Military Interaction Network, and the Initiative for the Study of Emerging Threats at NYU for really believing in our vision. Thank you also to Ms. Cherise Taylor for coordinating this event, and our student observer, Mr. Brenda Suaro, who has been kind enough to volunteer his time as a note taker for our forward-looking workshop report that will be published later on this year. With that said, I turn over to my partner, Dr. Yvan Ilunga, to start us off with the first session on the militarization of politics and the undemocratization of political spaces in Africa. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, dear Jomo. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be together again. As Dr. Gomez was saying earlier, it could have been great and better if we were in person. But of course, the context of public health or global public health makes it difficult for people to gather in this time. But at least this gives, again, a valid reason for us as scholars and practitioners to think of the impact of COVID and the global pandemic on not only the gatherings, but also to think of its impact on how institutions run and what could be the long-term prospect or impact of COVID dynamic. As Jumo said earlier, we will be discussing and debating on this particular session on the impact of the militarization of politics. But I want to start maybe by giving a quick transition from the last year workshop to today's or this year workshop. And I'm glad Madeleine is here with us because she was again with us last year when we had the other workshop, which was basically just a few weeks before the pandemic hit. And I remember we were sitting and talking that morning, and somehow we got news saying that the meeting which was being organized at the UN, which was I think the women, I don't know how they put it, but the annual meetings on genders and women programs at the UN was cancelled that day, but it was supposed technically to start within a week or so. That speaks to how in a few seconds, the whole program internationally was affected. And we were discussing then on what countries would be doing and how the responses will look like. But more specifically, we discussed on the militarizations of politics without knowing that it would be a big thing in 2020. And what we have observed since then was that most of democratic spaces and political spaces all over the world, including in Africa, have been completely militarized. So with some restrictions in terms of gatherings, restrictions in terms of movement. And the biggest question that can still be debated and asked today as well is the fundamentals of democracy. People would argue that, well, we cannot say for certain countries that democracy has been affected because these countries have never reached the level of being called democratic, right? And on the other side, one would say, well, but they were still on the trend of democracy. So, or they were experiencing democracy in their own form and model. And so basically, I'm trying to push to the reflection before we get started with a different conversation here. Is the fact that one, countries have been struggling within the democratic principles and practices in Africa. And other countries have been doing well, but both of them, at least all these countries, have been somehow affected and impacted by the dynamics of COVID. So now the biggest question that one could ask is the idea of sustainability of institutions and sustainability of values, of democratic values as we move forward. But this kind of been very much impacted lately. We have the case of Niger, we have the cases of Guinea and Mali. We've seen that apart from the fact that countries have been struggling with COVID, there has also been a military impact, involvement in the management of the public spaces and political spaces. So with that being said, we are having more of a conversational type of session. So we had guiding questions which were shared, but I will want us to jump in as you wish with the idea of trying to cover 3 things in 45 minutes, I guess, or 50. The first point that or elements that we try to cover in this session is to basically think of the impact of COVID, right? The impact of COVID on political and democratic trends. So has there really been an impact? Or if there is an impact, so what is that? And how can we reflect on sustainability of institutions in the age of COVID and post-COVID as well? And the second element that we would want to discuss in this session is the limitation put on civil and political liberties due to COVID. There's been some narratives, political narratives, where people will say, well, members of opposition parties will not gather because of COVID, but you can still see those in power in different countries still gathering, right? So what are the limitations on or put on civil and political liberties due to COVID? And how can we overcome those limitations if nations have to change and democracy need to be saved? And the last element or point is basically the management of democratic processes. And there we have elections being postponed. In some places, regions will not be able to vote because they don't have the right tools, and either the logistics cannot get there, or for certain reasons, people will say, well, your health situation is at risk, it's high, and the vulnerability is so high, therefore we cannot organize election in these particular places, or constitutions will change and so on. So those becomes the question of management of democratic processes. And we want to get the chance to discuss all this dynamic and see where we can position democracy and political liberties and civil liberties, where we can position political spaces in Africa, knowing that there is a tendency, a trend of that space being highly militarized. So with that being said, I will just open up the floor with probably the very first question. What do you think is the impact of COVID on the militarizations of the political space on the continent? Please feel free to use the raise button or raise hand button, or you can write in the chat and we will call your name, but it is a very formal, informal type of conversation. So
we have a Patty Chang who wants to talk.
Great. Thank you for helping me with that. That would be great. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much, Jumo and Yvan, for organizing this really interesting topic and workshop at the moment. I mean, when we're just thinking about the impact of COVID on institutions and also in political spaces in sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, just looking at the overall trend so far from 2020, at least, when we're thinking about elections that were held and then also elections that were postponed, for instance, it appears to me, and obviously, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that it seems like a little bit of a mixed bag at the moment in terms of that. And when I'm thinking about elections that were held, at least, we do see those sort of trends in terms of, let's say, voter turnout, right? There was a bit of a low voter turnout for Mali, for instance, and also Benin, but then also a high voter turnout for Burundi and Malawi, and then kind of medium for Guinea. And we know that, for instance, looking at indicators, that low voter turnouts has been really inimical to actually a harbinger for post-electoral political violence that has taken place on the continent itself. Mali, for instance, as we mostly know, has been a military coup, or a coup within a coup, in the last over the last year or two. And so you've seen that to some extent COVID has contributed to low voter turnout, but in certain cases where, for example, in Mali, the terrorism and violent extremism in the north and central parts of the country has also contributed to disincentives for Malians to actually head to the polling stations as well. So that's the confluence of political violence that has been ongoing and taking place within the country, coupled with the pandemic as well. But then there's also sort of bright spots, for example, in Malawi, when there was a contested sort of outcome of the election in 2019, and then the election that was held in 2020, which went overall pretty well, especially in the sense that there was alternation and the political opposition won in that particular context. At the same time, you see that also postponed elections in 2020 triggered armed conflict, for instance, in Ethiopia, and also in Chad for the legislative elections, where elections have been periodically displayed. So at least in my book so far, looking at it, the impact has been sort of kind of either a direct contribution to certain forms of delayed political alternations, or otherwise has had a kind of a limited effect. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. No, thank you. You triggered in my mind one question, but I will just put it out here and then we'll probably come back to it. Especially when you talk about low participation, right? Is that because people are expressing lack of trust in institutions or democratic practices, or it's because there's been just the impact of COVID? So I'm just thinking as well on the level of trust in institutions. Has the process evolved? And I'm glad you used the case of Burundi, where you had the huge turnaround, and of course the power went still to people who were in charge. That's another dynamic, I guess, one could think about, if that high participation was somehow constrained also. But we will get back to probably that question of institution and relationship between participation and trust in the institution. But there is a hand, I think, Chioma.
Yes, hi, thank you. And apologies for being late. Thank you, Juma, and thank you everyone for the invitation. Really great to be here. I think Patty makes some great points about a lot of the different examples that have happened through the continent. Ethiopia is an interesting one, I think, because Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, I mean, he won a Nobel Peace Prize not too long ago, right? And then because of the postponement of the elections, we see an outbreak of violence and everything going on in the Tigray region. So I think Ethiopia is a particularly important example, but I do see that same story of this idea of kind of strong men in Africa refusing to give up power, right? And we've heard, President Obama say Africa needs strong institutions, not strong men. And we're still seeing that same narrative, strong men not wanting to give up power. But I know this conversation is about Africa, but I don't think this is solely in Africa. I mean, we saw it in the US as well, where we had COVID-19 making a major impact on our elections last year, right? So I think it's important to bring that up here too, but also to know that change is hard in a time of crisis. And so regardless of how we try to transition, I think pandemic or not, we will still have these issues. So I think it's important to kind of understand that in a pandemic society or any other time, it's important to have strong civil society engagement. I think that's something that pushes for a better electoral process, is that if you have an engaged civil society that can advocate for the people and it's a more people-centered approach, then that definitely helps as well. But yeah, those are great points by Patty. Just wanted to add in.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for those comments. Abigail?
Hi, thank you. Good morning. It's 7 a.m. here in Denver, Colorado. So I had to wake up really early. But I want to say thank you for this opportunity to be able to engage with you and also to meet the rest of the group. I do agree with the points that have been put across, and I wanted just to emphasize one aspect of these points, and that's, I think that the one thing that has enhanced the impact of COVID on political and civil rights, and even enhancing militarization. I think it's coming from the socioeconomic effects that the pandemic has had. So when the pandemic started, the UN Africa Bureau had an initial report on questioning whether the pandemic would have an impact on security on the continent. And I read the report, and some of it was based on forecasting. And so their model was forecasting that actually it would not have that. But fast forward now, we're seeing a change, and simply because the socioeconomic fabric of a number of these countries has been impacted. And so that has created tension within the communities. That has created tension, particularly among the youth, making them force governments to change their practices on service delivery, especially. But when we talk about service delivery, and these come back to measuring state capacity, state effectiveness in delivering to the citizens, which we know in most of these African states have a challenge in doing that. And so we saw that protests coming out of South Africa. We saw a number of protests in Zambia, and which led to the change in the political party that was in charge. And so I'm seeing an impact from a socioeconomic point of view, even though we are not yet seeing studies that are tying these directly, but I think that there's something going on within the states themselves. I also wanted to contribute on the aspect of militarization. I feel like it's a mix. There were some states you could say that had strong presence of the police and the military prior to elections and during elections. I'm thinking of Uganda, a little bit of Zambia, but in places like Malawi, we didn't see that coming out. And so I'm still trying to, I think maybe a bit of research needs to be done, or observe a little bit of what happened to different states, because it's still unfolding in my view that we can't really say there's an enhanced military, whether there was an enhanced militarization of these states, because the results are mixed. Some did have that extreme repression, but some did not have. And those that did have, perhaps we could talk about the types of regimes. Maybe they were more democratic than the others. Like if we compare Malawi and Zambia versus Uganda, and I'm trying to think of another country in West Africa, but we don't see the same. So maybe it could be, we could categorize them maybe by regime type, or by the type of leaders. So I would say it's a mix. I'll end here for now.
Oh, thanks a lot. I'm glad you raised also the point on the socioeconomic determinant of it. I was observing what happened in South Africa and, for instance, in the DRC. At some point, politicians or political leaders had argued that why should we have a lockdown while we know that having just 1 day of lockdown will not only create a healthy environment when it comes to public health, but it will expose more people to issues of poverty. And since most of the people work, for instance, in the informal economy, so there is that also dynamic on to which extent would community support the pressure of these restrictions. And of course, the looting example of the looting, and then I'll pass the word in South Africa, some would argue that it wasn't only a matter of justice, right? But it was more kind of an expression of frustration, and then say, well, we've been in lockdown for so long, we did not have enough resources, and now we have an opportunity to step out and then loot. So that is just an addition I wanted to add on that, and thank you so much, Big L. So I will call Madeleine, and maybe followed by Dan, and then Bright, and then we will keep going that way.
Great, thanks, Yvan. Yeah, and thanks for hosting this again. It's great to see the series continuing. I have two additional thoughts, one of which has kind of already been touched on, but one of the impacts of the virus, I think, has been it has accelerated what had already started, which was like an erosion from Africa, but from countries all over the world, an erosion of kind of trust and faith in the great powers of the world. You know, this is a pandemic that could have been prevented if the US and China had not been squabbling siblings with a poor relationship based on kind of the state of the kind of the relationship between the global powers. And so I do think that unfortunately, I think we're probably past the point of trying to prevent great power competition, or especially like Chinese and Russian inroads into African, like influence into African wars and African governance. And now at the stage of having to like saying these are players in African politics that are, or influencers in African politics that are here to stay. And how do we protect democratic norms in a context where countries are going to be making military agreements with Russia and Turkey, and so I do think that's, I don't actually know how you do that, but I do think it'd be interesting to innovate a little bit on how do you protect democratic norms while accepting that there are benefits to these countries of allying in certain circumstances with authoritarian countries. And it leads to my next point, which is one of the very few positive impacts of the virus, which has been that it's much easier to connect local civil society in African countries to ourselves and to policymakers here, right? Like now we have virtual hearings, we have virtual events, and you don't need to put someone on a plane to get the perspective, even, you know, getting them to the airport. Obviously you do need a wireless connection. But so thinking in terms of the benefit of that too, and how much more open things are to directly engaging with civil society and being able to speak with communities and groups that we would have had to rely on kind of an interlocutor to learn about their perspectives before. It's just something to, you know, celebrate in a way.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Madeleine. Dan?
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here. So I've just got a couple of thoughts on this question of militarization. I think one thing that might be quite helpful to distinguish here is between kind of forms of militarization which are deliberate and those which are almost a kind of reaction or in response to changed circumstances, essentially those that have either been induced by the pandemic or those which have been kind of intensified by it. So some of the kind of, I think there are some more kind of overt examples of you know, military coups, kind of a closure of democratic space, which is probably leaning more to one side than the other. But I think that what's happening is that in countries which have been severely affected economically by the pandemic, this has just made them created much more opening points for kind of militarization, many more opening points for coups or military type actors. But the thing that I would also kind of caution there is that in certain cases, some of the damage caused by COVID, at least to the national economies, can also act as an impediment to forms of militarization. So I think that you're one of the reasons that initially there was an increase in violence in a number of African countries, and Africa was kind of unique globally in terms of experiencing an increase in violence during the pandemic, was partly because a lot of states were trying to kind of compensate for lost revenues by engaging in shakedowns of the population. That Uganda would be one clear example of that one. But in the longer run, those kind of declining revenues might also lead to limits on types of, on the degree and intensity and protractedness of that violence as well. But I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. Appreciate the comment. And the dynamic of deliberate or reactional kind of militarization is, I guess it's key. At some point, maybe we can push a little bit on that. If we use the reactional aspect of it, then the biggest question is, what was the pressure put on institution and government to react military ways, right? And what was the threat to governmental institutions for them to use only that one as the biggest tool to organize and manage their public spaces? So, but again, this is just kind of a point I'm throwing out there and then trying to process it as well out. But I will ask Brett and followed by the Congo.
Yes, thanks, Yvonne. I just wanted to follow up on some of with the two quick thoughts kind of on some of the discussions around elections going on during the COVID pandemic. The point was raised kind of about how there was kind of uneven responses or very kind of different responses in different countries about whether or not to move forward with elections. But there was also in countries that did hold elections, there was also a lot of kind of variation in how those elections kind of were carried out. I'm thinking here most notably of like the presence of election monitoring, election observers. In a lot of instances where elections did go forward, COVID was kind of used as an excuse or justification to bar observers from entering into the country. So I think kind of the importance of election observation and monitoring, especially from actors, regional actors like the AU, was kind of really also sort of emphasized in how those elections took place. Secondly, I kind of also wanted to bring up the case of Zambia as well. I think looking at the Zambia example, I think we did see kind of counter to a lot of what we saw in some other countries. I think we did really see sort of actually a reinforcement of democratic institutions, electoral institutions in Zambia. We saw the transition of power away from Lungu, who had at times over the course of his tenure there had been a lot of concerns about his kind of authoritarian bend, or starting to make sort of ethnic appeals for voter support. And we saw that really sort of push back against in Zambia in a really kind of emphatic way. I mean, I think we had close to 70% voter turnout. The opposition party won, I think, by close to 15%. And then you had sort of a very transition of power. So I think that's an interesting case of where, we saw a positive kind of trend in democratization on the continent. So yeah, just those 2 points I wanted to raise.
Great, no, thank you so much. Great. Luco, and then being followed by Benjamin.
Sure. So one of the things that I was thinking about in the case of the impact of COVID on elections, as someone who's coming from Congo, and that's kind of where I focus a lot of my work, Congo, the election isn't going to take place until 2023. And so I'm very curious to see how COVID, if at all, will have any impact, or if the leadership will use COVID as a reason to delay elections or to try and amend the upcoming elections that folks are so, desperately anticipating. especially from my time just recently being in the country, there's a sense of COVID denying that the pandemic is not existing, even though, you know, people have had their own separate examples, and we see certain areas definitely taking a lot more of an economic impact versus other spaces and places. And so it'll be very interesting to see how this all plays out as we, you know, quickly start to approach the 2023 election deadline.
So thank you so much, Luko. You know, the point of 2023, it's interesting. And of course, it's happening in the DRC, but also other places where I'm assuming that one of the arguments could be financial constraint. People will use it, we could not pull enough resources because our traditional supporters or funders were also hit by economic issues. But again, this is just kind of an argument which may still come, but it's interesting to see where we're going with within the post-COVID period. Yeah. So Benjamin, and then May, and we will finish that part with Oluwole.
Thank you very much, Yvan. Thank you, Jumo, for the invitation. I just want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Benjamin Pedrini. I'm from the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in Washington, D.C., where I focus on conflict and development, and with a focus on Africa. So my point on this, Yvan, and on the research that we have done on particularly on armed conflict and on wars in the continent in the last year or two since COVID hit, is that COVID obviously has had a big impact, but in many cases, and maybe in most cases, has been a further enabler of dynamics that were already there, of structural factors, of conflictual structural factors. So I just have a note of caution of that I don't think it's very useful in trying to really just dig into the COVID impact and where we would sort of reinvent the wheel in a sense when we already have a base of knowledge of all the issues that bring about conflict, and in terms of democratization and in terms of political trends, the demise of global norms, as someone else has mentioned, and the rise of conflict in the continent since 2014-15, these all predate COVID. So it's just a note of caution on that. And I leave it at that. I have another point, but will be for the next question. Thanks.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Benjamin. That's great. Thanks. And May?
Thank you very much. No, Benjamin actually said what I was aiming for. I think we're reading the situation now, but we have to take into consideration that I think what COVID presented was a governance challenge for many of the governments in Africa. But it laid bare also the institutional fragility within many of the African institutions, whether on the national or even on the community level. And therefore, I think the only way for governments to maybe oppress the protests and the other voices coming out was to shift to militarization, either to undermine the fragility that they have their institutions, or that they were not able to respond to COVID in a manner that was acceptable by the population. And I think we saw this in Nigeria, we saw it in Mali, but I think what COVID did was just put the governments on a test that they failed to conduct. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thanks. That's a great point. So, and I'm glad that, well, that you said it put government on the test and they failed. Very interesting. Yeah. Oluwole?
Okay. Thank you so much for having me in this panel conversation on I must really say a big thank you to the organizer, particularly Dr. Jumoke, for the wonderful invitation, and for Taylor as well for the constant reminder. I think I came 17 minutes late into after I've received the mail, and I was slightly concerned that probably the program is over. But I think I was still part of the first 5 persons to log in. So I quite appreciate this conversation and the wonderful invitation that was extended to me. So I will talk basically on Nigeria. And okay, good afternoon. I'm talking from Senegal in Dakar now, but I will talk basically on Nigeria. And by a stretch of imagination, the first question that readily comes to mind is that pandemic is not a regular day experience. I think the major one historically was probably the Spanish flu of 1918. So almost 100 years after, we're talking about another pandemic. And then I think it offers us a lot of lessons in actually preparing future generation, because pandemic of this magnitude might not, maybe some of us, nobody can predict when the next one is going to come, but the reality of the day-to-day human evolution is the fact that it will always come, but what is going to make a critical difference is the preparedness of the people. And I think, broadly speaking, because of the multipurpose training that the military institution or the armed forces of any nation is expected to have gone through, you would expect that the military is going to be among the, what they call the first responder in terms of providing safeguards to the people, maybe medically and otherwise, in terms of making sure that the preparedness, the response is actually well targeted, because of the multipurpose training that a military institution is expected to have gone through. But the experience in Nigeria and most African countries doesn't really reflect that, in the sense that rather it became a business as usual, particularly in terms of wanton human rights abuse. I think in African context, it was turnover. While the military was delivering relief materials to people in other countries, you hear people were being killed, people are being beaten. In fact, in Nigeria, as at the time that we recorded about maybe 4 COVID-19 deaths or thereabout, we've already had about 18 persons that have been killed as a result of wanton human rights abuse. And then the people question in the mind of most people was that this militarized approach was it going to cost us more life than even the COVID-19 itself? So I think that is a major fallout in terms of wrong deployment of the military in the age of pandemic. It's a critical lesson for us, which also shows that probably the military has not really evolved from what it used to be in the days where the democratic space was not actually open up for participation in Africa. And then that hangover played out in the pandemic again. So for me, in terms of pandemic response, particularly the securitized approach, what I think is important and the lesson that we will expect the military, African military institutions to learn from this is now to mainstream this into probably their training, their preparedness in terms of what could also happen maybe in the next decade. And by this, I'm talking about mainstreaming it into their training. If pandemic preparedness has never been part of the military training, this is a time for that to be mainstream into the training curriculum and the simulations and everything that goes on in the military. I think is the number one thing that must be seen going forward, because like I said earlier, the multipurpose training that the military institution is expected to be exposed to also presupposes that they should be able to play the role of the first responder in this situation of crisis. And then by extension as well, I think the executive arm of government will also have a lot to do in this regard, because what we found during the at the outbreak of COVID-19 in Nigeria in particular is that everything was suddenly subjected to executive order. It is the president that is determining when there's going to be a shutdown, when people are going to go out and all those things. And then in democracies where the space is actually closed, a lot of things, a lot of abuses is bound to stem out of that. So I think we need a broader conversation in terms of reform. Pandemic in a pandemic situation. This one, it caught us unaware. And in terms of preparedness, I think there are useful lessons for us so that whether as the military institution in particular, that must be cherished and documented and mainstream into the training of the military institution so that if there is another pandemic, we are better prepared to handle it institutionally. Thank you. And the military has a role to play in that.
Great. No, well, thanks a lot. With that point, I will have Walter say something, and then I want us to move to another important element, I guess, into which has come up from this conversation is yes, issues of institution capabilities. So I guess we need to also think of, apart from just institution, kind of the governance system itself. And the second element, which I would want us maybe to touch still on the militarization of these political spaces, it's that civil-military relationships. Yes, Olwole, you mentioned an important element on training. And if we have to train, the military have to be trained for pandemic. But before then, there is this ongoing relationship between the civil and the military, which has to be enlightened. And I haven't heard in this conversation so far us mentioning the police. So where is the police in the security structure of many African countries? Because it has just moved from civilian to military straight, and looks like the police is not there. Or if it's there, what is the place into this dynamic of providing public safety in this timing of COVID? And the last point, which I would want us maybe to talk a little bit as we'll be moving, is the timing of many of these executive orders. Were they very much relevant or appropriate to this the crisis, or it was kind of a copy and paste from a European policies? They say, well, there will be lockdown for 14 days, and then you see that being implemented in other African countries as well. So those are a few points that I would want us also to get through before the session end. But Walter, you have the word.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Yvan, and Taylor, Sherez, and Dr. Jumo for letting me get an idea about this workshop. And I'm really happy to be part of this conversation, which all of us, I can say, have been part of it. And it came as a shock to most of us, and more a shock to Africa, which we are really focusing on. I have a few points which we could reflect on. I am originally from Cameroon. I will touch on Cameroon example from time to time, but I will also like to touch other countries. Well, if you see the way the COVID arrived Africa, Africa has been redefined again from the north. It has been, Africa was completely redefined in the sense that if you follow the social media and if you followed what the north was talking about Africa, it was about Africa should be preparing for its worst. Because what was happening in Europe was also seen as was the trend that was going to go to Africa, which most countries lack of these hospitals, lack of hospital personnel. So Africa was completely to be wiped off. It was an opportunity for Africa to be redefined. And even now, as we are talking, Africa is defined in terms of colors. It's a yellow zone, it is a red zone, it is a brown zone. It's all about colors now. And so getting to Africa now is about which country are you going to? Is it in yellow? Is it in red? Or if you are coming from the red zone, you are quarantined. Anyway, that is just an aside. The first thing I was trying to look at was to look at the governmental institutions. How did the COVID strengthen or weaken some countries' institutions? For example, I took East Africa. If you take East Africa and you draw from Tanzania, Magufuli, who was democratically elected, he was one of the people that held that there was even no COVID and preferred that Tanzania should pray. They should go but to church. When other countries were talking about 1.5 distancing, he was encouraging prayers. At the end of the day, you would see that the COVID came and swallowed him. And then just nearby was Museveni. I don't know how democratic Museveni is or how democratic Uganda is. But if you look at the reforms which Museveni brought into Uganda, he has served Uganda. And then you look at the regional politics in East Africa. People did not move carelessly in East Africa. You cannot move from Kenya into Uganda or vice versa. And then I took a parallel in Europe. The European Union, there were a lot of boundaries moving even inside the European, moving inside Europe. And then if you leave from East Africa to Cameroon, which is actually where I come from, when I pronounce Cameroon, there's a lot of humor about Cameroon right now, because Cameroon is one of the countries in Central West Africa that is fighting a very interesting war. A war which is, to me, as a result of a premature decolonization, where the Anglophones are now struggling to get, quote unquote, a utopian type of a state, which they call the Ambazonia. And it is a state which the government shows its legitimacy on its citizens by using violence. You understand Cameroon well in terms of Max Weber. But in the Corona COVID-19 period, this war was raging on. And just like my friend talking from Senegal, the military was really, really galvanized not to look out to what was happening with COVID, but rather to go into the northwest and southwest Cameroon, where the Ambazonians are struggling for their independence. And so the human rights abuse were more and more actually in the way that the military were given so much powers, not to help in distributing, call it the mask, the testing or whatever, but to clamp down on the separatists. And then the president itself, because if you look at the state in Cameroon, the president is all in all. He's the executive, he's the legislative, he's the judiciary. He's all in all. And it is within this time that we find President Biya staying back in Cameroon for close to four months, ever since he came to power, because he ruled Cameroon from Paris. Later on, he was ruling Cameroon from Switzerland. But then, after a while, he actually had to tame the COVID-19 and had to really visit Switzerland. But despite the fact that the Cameroonian diaspora had warned that he should not come and always marching down to the hotel in which he was living, this time around, he could not, the civil society in Switzerland and the diaspora could not actually operate. And that to me was quite very interesting. Then on the other hand, the funds that were given to Cameroon to fight the COVID-19 were actually swallowed up, ended up in individual pockets. if you have been following off Cameroon, Cameroon is one of the countries which had embezzled the COVID-19 funds. And the corruption has been it's a religion in Cameroon anyway. There's a lot of corruption. And so the IMF funds that were set aside or given by IMF for trying to handle the COVID-19 was actually something that ended up with people swallowing it up. So I think my reflection ends on this. Maybe I will continue after break. Thank you very much, Yvan, for giving me time.
No, thank you. It's an important point. You raise important and I would say provocative points as well. You know, when you say corruption is religion, so it's just tells the dynamic, right, on how this is very much into the system. And as we can tell, throughout the continent, we have similarities. You have anti-corruption practices, declarations, especially being corruption being exposed during the time of COVID. But again, some of these are not very much new, but they've been they have come to the front recently, and I guess there is a trend to try to address them there. So there is, I think Michael has a hand raised, and then we will move to our last 15 minutes of the session.
Yeah, thank you, Yvan. Dr. Yvan and my sister, Dr. Ayandele, and the host, also Sherry Stello, for a constant reminder and all the communication. I think everything was seamless. I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation. What I want to pivot on a little bit was you ask a very important question that is missing in this conversation about the police as an institution as well within Africa. And I want to take us, to an overview, because it's to provide a context in terms of why militaries get so, the whole issue around militarization and how COVID has actually laid bare the need for African governments to engage with the military again. I mean, if you really take a closer look at the post-colonial political trajectory when it comes to African states, you will realize that there is really a complex web of civil military relations, and by extension, that points and speaks to the kind of power and its legitimacy as well. So majority of the African countries, if you study African politics and African historiography, they achieved their political independence on a silver platter. Namibia, South Africa, I'll say yes, they launched an armed struggle, but that in itself was not the way independence was achieved. It was achieved through negotiation. And so involving this African nationalists and colonial administration. So there was a kind of an agreement that was reached. So when these institutions were set up, the military became power unto itself. And this trend of the military, you could see that it manifests itself in a state of coup d'etat, and that you can see in West Africa, especially within the mid-60s to the 80s. But then it's developed an enormous pessimism about the possibility for democracy in Africa. Now, how the military become involved in national politics in Africa is not an historical accident. I would say that structural root, and other scholars have pointed to this, the structural root of that is in colonialism itself, because the authority was predicated upon conquest, upon cohesion, and violence, in which this security first forces were systematically used to impose the foreign domination on African people who were considered to be colonial subjects. And so what we see now after post-COVID that is manifesting itself is that the military has become the last resort again, as always, when political leadership is in decline. This is what the leaders resort to consolidate their power. And so we see that in many countries now, post-independence, when leaders have failed to transform the state, for instance, and the military in general as well, what we are seeing now is that this social contract that might have been between the people and the state, and that have served as the basis of legitimacy between sustainable democratic governance is crumbling. So in a world that the necessity for political survival now has been compelled by most military leaders, either manipulating the state or the state manipulating its populace in terms of entrenching power. It is no surprise. This is what we see because of the lack of social safety net. I don't want to preempt the discussion in the next session, but because of all this loss of social safety nets, the lack of trade, the lack of engagement that's out there, the frustration, I think somebody was mentioning about Zambia, that is exactly the reason why the youth were able to galvanize and mobilize, because of the frustration of their lack of livelihood and hardship that was just prevalent there. And they organized and ensured that the president could not be elected. And so we see this militarization, that the police as an institution, to your point, Yvan, is not equipped to deal with the kind of consolidation that the leaders would like. And so the military, a lot of funding and a lot of money has gone into that. So because it's a machinery of oppression, and that is what it has been during colonial occupation, and that is what the post-independent states sadly have kept it for, and it has continued. So I think those are my thoughts for now, and I'll stop there.
Great. No, thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Page?
Thanks, Yvan. I'm Paige Arthur. I'm at the Center on International Cooperation, also at NYU, with Jumo. And I just quickly wanted to pick up some points that Michael was making, that Benjamin was making, and also I think it was Walter. And so one of the things that we're doing at CAC is we're trying to understand the intersection between COVID impacts and macroeconomic risks. And so I think it was Walter who talked about the IMF packages. And so I'm actually would like to put out a question to the group rather than making a comment myself. But there are all of these emergency packages that have been delivered from the World Bank and from the IMF. And I think early on, we held some meetings around Cote d'Ivoire and around Guinea to understand how the packages were being designed. Were they really operating as inclusive social safety nets, picking up on Michael's point? Were they, actually designed in ways that could, continue to enable existing risks or political dynamics, drawing on some of the things that Benjamin was saying. And, the first emergency package in Cote d'Ivoire, when it was being negotiated with government, really focused on the formal sector of the economy and had completely missed the informal sector, which of course is a very good portion of the economy. That's where most women are working in Cote d'Ivoire. And so it really took kind of external influence from the UN, from the World Bank itself, to make sure that that package was designed in a more inclusive way. And so this presents a really difficult challenge, partly for structural reasons. The way these packages are designed, they're agreed with government, and it's not really an open, transparent, inclusive process. And so how is that affecting the dynamics? Because these are massive amounts of money. So it's really more of a question for a group than the comment. Thank you.
Great. No, thanks a lot. That's an important and interesting question. Maybe I will just probably add one quick thing here. Is the dynamic of redefining, or for instance, how generally on the African continent we assess economic performances, right? The indicators of economic performances are always those within the formal economy, right? And but we happen always to miss the bigger portion of the economy, which is informal and sometimes not even bankerized. So there is that idea of not moving into formality, but probably for many reasons, avoiding taxes and avoiding government involvement. I guess those are also important things which I believe had impacted, right, some decisions of COVID as well. So some countries did not want to have the lockdown because they argued that, well, we have a bigger portions of our population operating in the informal sector. But again, how much of the assistance were they receiving into that informal sector? That's an important question, I guess, just a way of complementing what you said. And it is very much open to the group. But we have only 5 minutes for this session to hand in order to transition to the other. But we will also have a networking session after the second session, so which will be, I guess, 10 or 15 minutes. And during those that networking session, we will discuss some of these things which we did not manage to cover in the formal session. But I want us to maybe finish in that with this session with one projection. We talked about institutions, we talked about the military, we talked about government. So my question, which we can respond to it as a way of projecting the future post-COVID period. What can civil society, movement, and organization do to make sure that in a post-COVID period, government don't use force as a way of managing populations, subjecting populations, or even controlling populations when their political or security agenda is not well received by the population. Basically, what is the place of civil society in promoting stability in Africa in a post-COVID period? I know it's a very packed question, but we only have three minutes for that reflection. If anyone wants to jump in, that would be great.
I can say something.
Sure.
I think that one of the things that we've seen in Africa and I think which came out during our discussion is the role of ICTS. I think previously, I used to view the civil society in Africa almost non-existent because they did not have any teeth. They were not able to check on the government as they should because they were receiving funds from the government and they had very small budgets to work with. And most of the money they would have would be donor tied. And so donors also had their own agendas. It was so hard for the civil society to be able to find their place and make their place known and speak to the politics of the country. But I think that the unique opportunity that has been provided by ICTS has given our civil society a tool that they can use to mobilize, especially the young people, the youth, to be able to put their agenda on the table, agenda known to the government. And so I think that post-COVID, we're going to see a revised civil society that is able to speak on the issues, whether it be freely or not is another thing, but I think that their voice is there. Another thing I wanted to add would be, it would be great if the civil society could push a reimagination of the military. From the two people that contributed on militarization, particularly, you had a question on the role of the police. And I was thinking to myself that growing up in Africa, I've never had a fear for the police. The reason why is that police brutality when I was growing up, I did not experience that. So when I see a policeman in Africa, I'm not threatened. When I see a soldier, it's a different conversation. If you see a soldier in Africa, there is something going on, you know, there's an unstable situation happening in the country, which is different from here. When I see a policeman in the US, my instinct is run, you know, do not engage with them. But